Spencer, on to the main event.
Thanks, Lauren. So this morning, I'm really excited to introduce our 14th CCC speaker today, Dr. Alex Perkins, with his postdoc Guido Espana. Dr. Perkins is an associate professor in the Department of Biological Sciences at the University of Notre Dame and concurrently an assistant professor of applied and computational mathematics and statistics. He's an expert on infectious disease modeling and epidemiology, and is one of, if not the most foremost expert on modeling of mosquito-borne diseases. And he's worked on diseases like malaria, yellow fever, dengue, chikungunya, Zika. I think his workload has probably increased exponentially as these mosquito-borne diseases have really started emerging and causing global issues. His work has focused on mosquito life cycle modeling and transmission, incorporating dynamics in models, including impact of interventions, temperature and global climate change, as well as disease mapping and forecasting. I think his focus has probably switched a bit in the recent months away from mosquito-borne diseases. So today he's here to chat with us about COVID-19 work that his lab has done. He, along the lines of COVID-19, he actually, I think just his paper came out in PNAS on estimating the unobserved infections in the United States during the early stages of the epidemic. So that was a really important early work that they put out months ago, very informative. And also now those results have been bolstered by the CDC seroprevalence studies that have found very similar findings, that about 10% of infections were detected early on. They've also worked on the optimal control of the pandemic with non-pharmaceutical interventions and school reopenings. So with that, I will let him and Guido take it away.
All right, thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks, Spencer, for the very generous introduction. Yeah, so like Spencer said, I've worked primarily on mosquito-borne diseases, but you know, just like you all and lots of other infectious disease modelers and people from other areas, you know, early in the year, I was kind of contemplating, like, you know, should I jump into this whole COVID thing? At what point do I do that? What question do I tackle? So the paper that we just had come out in PNAS was the first foray into that. That's where I was just, you know, sitting around watching CNN and just kind of couldn't take it anymore and wanted to put some numbers on some of the stuff I was seeing. So yeah, and ever since we've just been kind of doing more and more. So today I'm going to hand it over to Guido in a minute to present this work, but the work that we're going to be talking about today uses FRED, the Framework for Reconstructing Epidemiological Dynamics, I believe, an agent-based model developed out of the University of Pittsburgh a number of years ago. I was very fortunate to recruit Guido a few years ago as a postdoc in my lab. He had actually had experience at Pitt working with that team and had, for his dissertation, applied FRED to model chikungunya in Colombia. And so I knew that he was a real expert on the code there, and just in general is very good technically and in many other ways. And so when this situation came up, we thought that FRED might be a useful framework to consider for doing some things with COVID. And so we've been working on that for a few months. And then what Guido is going to be presenting today is really our first set of results out of that. We spent a lot of time focusing on calibrating that model. You know, for a model that complex, it can be a bit of a challenge to try to calibrate it to real world data and to make sure that it checks out in multiple different ways. One thing that Guido will mention is, fortunately in Indiana, they've done a really nice survey where they've done a nice randomized sample across the state to look for both active infection and past exposure, including with serology. And so that provides a nice data set for us to validate against. And it is a lot of the reason we focused on Indiana thus far. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Guido and then hope that we have some time for discussion afterwards.
Cool. Hello. Thanks again for inviting us. I'm gonna share my screen. I don't know if I'm able to. Yeah. Okay. Can everyone hear me okay? Is my microphone okay? Cool.
Yep.
There we go. Okay, so yeah, I'm just going to talk about this study that we've been working very recently. And Sorry, this is not looking fine. Just a second. Sorry, my computer kind of like freaked out for a minute. Okay. Let's try again. Okay, yeah, so I'm gonna talk about the impact of school children going back to school in this fall in Indiana. Now, students are going back to school this fall, and I think the discussion has been focusing on what's there's a lot of positive effects and negative effects of going back to school, of course, and the question is, what's the impact of school children on the burden of COVID-19? One of the interesting things is that students are less susceptible, less symptomatic, so that would make it seem as a viable option. Now, there are very many negative factors associated with kids staying at home, which is, for instance, families must stay at home, so they might not be able to go to work. And some students rely on school meals, and these are just a few of the factors. So to address this question of what's the impact of school reopening on the COVID-19 epidemic in Indiana, we use, as Alex just mentioned, the FRED platform. And this agent-based model was originally designed for flu, for the pandemic flu in 2009. And it's been applied to other diseases, vector-borne diseases. This is an example of a measles outbreak in Pennsylvania. So what we had to do is to modify FRED a little bit, and so that we could represent the natural history of disease parameters of COVID-19, and we also needed to make some implementation of the adaptive non-pharmaceutical interventions. So just a brief description of what this model looks like. We represent every human in the population, in this case Indiana, using a synthetic population, and they have geographic and demographic characteristics that represent the population of Indiana. Now, children have different activities than adults. So you can say, well, adults might go to work, well, students or children might go to school, and they share these places with other agents or humans. College campuses and long-term care facilities are simulated as these group quarters, where they are spending more time with each other, kind of like cluster, a little bit separated from the overall community. And children may also have contact and adults in the overall community. So the virus can be transmitted in any of these places as they can be defined in the community. It might not be a place. Now, when a person, in terms of the dynamics, virus, a person might be susceptible, exposed to the virus, but not infectious. Then the person might be infectious but asymptomatic, or with symptoms, then might be isolated or quarantined. And people with symptoms can be hospitalized, or they can die, or they can recover. So this is just a basic description of the model that we're using.
And Guido,
Yes.
can I ask a question? Do you mind?
Yeah, of course.
So which of those components are, I guess, kind of come standard with FRED, and which of them did you have to modify? I assume the compartmental diagram you modified, but are the various, agent-based interactions, do those come standard with FRED?
These are standard with FRED, yes. This all comes with FRED, all of these interactions. We had to change here, not the structure, but the parameters associated with these transitions. And then we had to change, I'll talk a little bit more about it in a bit, different adaptive behaviors, mostly like staying at home or wearing a face mask.
Thanks.
Yep. And these are the parameters that I was talking about. So we had to include parameters that are For instance, the probability of symptoms, as you can see, well, there's a lower probability of symptoms for younger people than for older people. And we also have the incubation period, symptomatic period, and the probability of death, which is also very focused on the older ages. Now here, the 121, you might interpret just as old as they get. The symptom onset, and finally the pre-infectious period and the infectious period. These are all parameters that we had to specify in FRED to make it more COVID-like. Another change that we had to make is that, well, there's some evidence that children are less susceptible to infection, and this comes from a paper in Nature from Davis and others. So basically, we just had to, we're just using a logistic function here to assume that people under 20 are much less susceptible than over 20. Yeah, another general parameters that we had to adapt in the model is the, as many of you are aware, of course, there was shelter and home around April, where people mostly stay at home. This is where they picked. People stayed at home, and then people have been going slowly back to work. And we see that after June in Indiana, this is Indiana, it's kind of like stabilizing for a little bit. So we're doing is using the Google mobility trends to inform what percentage of the population at staying at home in any single day. And something similar for people wearing face masks. So instead of assuming that it's a constant rate, we are using the trends from Google Trends and people looking for shopping and for a face mask. And then we're using that cumulative number to inform how many people, what's the percentage of people wearing face masks, and the actual magnitude we're informing it with a survey from the New York Times that has the county by county information of what's the proportion of people wearing a face mask always or never or sometimes. So we're using the trends from this from this time series, but we are scaling it up and down to represent what we need to match the data. And so in this study, we focus in Indiana, and as Alex was mentioning, there is a population prevalence study that estimated in April. There's actually 2 points, but I think this is there's only the first phase that was published. So this is, we're using this study to validate our model instead of calibrating it to this data. What we're calibrating our model is to the daily incidence of deaths, hospitalizations, and the proportion of positive tests. And we're also, one particular thing that that we were very interested in matching was the age structure of the deaths, because most of the deaths in Indiana, there are around 50% of the deaths are in over 80 years old. So what we did for that is also use information on the nursing homes specific deaths, and in our model we assumed that there was some proportion of the daily incidence of prevalence of infections would visit nursing homes, and then they would kind of like see this infection in nursing homes, because it's very difficult to just naturally recreate this outbreaks in nursing homes in our model. And so we use just for this, we just simulated several thousands of parameters and calculated the likelihood based on this 4 pieces of data, and just sampled the ones that looked the best for taking into account all these 4 types of data. Now, well, this is just a list of the parameters that were calibrated to the data. I'm just gonna go fast through this, and this is the study. The study from Indiana, where we're matching, we are just doing a reasonably good job at matching the data, but we're not actually fitting it to this data. We're just comparing it, and it shows that it's around 2-3% in June 1st. So this is a good validation for us to know that that is not just the daily trends as I showed before, but also this age structure and just the overall rate of infections, the infection attack rate. Now, so one of the scenarios that we were going to consider was just what happens if we open at full capacity, no one wears a face mask in the school, the overall community wears a face mask as they were doing it. And what we find is that, as you can see in the top figure, when they open in August 24, the reproductive number goes up to almost 2. So it's almost the same as in the beginning. And we can explain this in the middle panel here, where you see the green is the proportion of infections that happen in schools. And we're seeing that there was a significant proportion of infections happening early in the epidemic. And when we reopen schools, they again go and have a large proportion of these infections. And we can see in the bottom panel how they actually increase largely, even larger than the first outbreak. Now that's a little bit unrealistic.
I have a question. Sorry.
Yep.
In those results, these are simulation results, right?
Yes.
In those results, when you open schools, do you know approximately what the prevalence is in the city?
The overall prevalence?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is, well, not the city, we're doing it as statewide, and what we're doing is this, so this is maybe around here would be, yeah, this is what we're using, what we open, we're using the data up to here, to this point, so we have the, for instance, the incidence and the number of deaths, and this is the proportion of test positive, so we don't have the actual prevalence, we don't know what the real value is, but we have what the model shows based on the data that we're fitting into at that point, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I'm just curious what that translates to in your model in terms of like cases per 1,000 people or 100,000 people at the time that schools open. But you may not know that off the top of your head. But
yeah, that's a good question. I probably should know it, but I do not know it in the top of my head. I'm sorry.
Yeah, and that's one of the points of discussion is when is it safe to open schools as a function of what the ambient prevalence is.
Yes, and something I would like to point out here is that this is very specific for Indiana. So this is just whatever we have for the prevalence in Indiana. And something else is that you can see here the reproductive number is actually a little bit below 1. So that might give you an indication of what the current dynamics are.
Yeah, I would just chime in and say, I think that's a good point about, what's the context for this relative to other places. And that's something we could look into. But I guess my impression looking at things in Indiana is that it has been relatively stable for the last month or two. And, I think ours and other estimates of the reproduction number, have it around like a 0.8 or something. So it's probably a better situation here than it is a lot of other places. But yeah, it's a good point.
Yeah, well, I guess I was going to wait to ask this later, but I'll ask it now. So one of the things that struck me, I think it was around slide 9, where you had the slide up with the comparison to the actual data. Maybe the slide was this uptick in hospitalizations at the end. In recently, that's where there's sort of a departure from the model. Do you have a sense of what's happening there in Indiana?
Sorry, I didn't know if you
maybe
were
I'll jump in and Guido, you can chime in
Yeah.
too if you want. Yeah, that's something we've definitely noticed and wondered about. One thing I'll just say from the model perspective, I think one reason we probably can't match that too well is that we're forcing it pretty strongly with the mobility trends and with the face masks. And, those don't really sort of give any sort of pattern that would, help recreate that pattern in the hospitalizations. And then the other thing is, you look at the deaths and the positivity and it's pretty flat. And I don't know, maybe the hospitalizations is more reliable and maybe we should be tracking that more. But I think, the big reason we're not is that the model is a little constrained in that regard. But yeah, I don't know. I guess I don't know if you have any other thoughts, but that's kind of how we think about it.
Yeah, thanks.
So one question on this slide. So does the reproduction number fall below 1 because herd immunity is reached here, or is there some sort of other dynamics going on?
You mean in November?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I wouldn't say it's herd immunity, even though I'm not showing here what the attack rate is at that point. A couple of things is that the overall population in the simulation has around 50% of face mask adherence. And there is another factor that just skipped my mind. Well, there's also, if you notice right up here, we're assuming that around 10% stay at home until the end of the simulation. And this is just based on the trends from June to August, that they seem to be fairly flat. And this might be just people like me or like us that probably can actually stay at home for a longer period, right? So we have like this basal proportion of people staying at home. So, and when with the overall population wearing face masks, I think that has an impact of reducing the RT. That doesn't mean that if we take both of those down, there won't be another outbreak. So that would be a difference. I think it's a combination of population, the attack rate, and plus this other two factors, what drives it down to below
I see.
1. Yeah.
So it's not a naive herd immunity, but it's like an effective herd immunity, probably.
Yes.
Something like that, yeah.
And one other thing, I'll add before Guido moves on. This scenario is pretty unrealistic in the sense that, first of all, that schools are at full capacity and there's no face mask, but also that there wouldn't be additional actions triggered. If we started to see a peak that was looking way bigger than what we saw in the spring, of course, that would trigger things that would probably prevent this from happening. But just as kind of a reference point, that's what we see here. But I don't know, Guido, maybe you should move on to the other scenarios we looked at.
Yep. Okay. Just briefly, in this scenario, we see that there's a large uptake in the infection. So why does the RT increase if children are less susceptible? That's a fair question. And this is just an example in one of the counties in a small subset of the simulation, where the green color represents infections that happen in school, orange happen in households, and then the purplish, it's where they happen in other places. While the circles show children, and then the adults are represented with squares. So you can see here how the infections that start in school, they actually spread mostly into households, and then they can spread into the overall community. One thing to point out here is that we're assuming that the face mask, that nobody is wearing face mask in their households, so that has a large difference in the efficacy of transmission in other places than in the household. So there's a downstream effect there. Now, we studied 9 different scenarios, which is a combination of these 3 different scenarios in the left that show face mask. We assume there's 100%, 75%, and 50%, with the ones in the right one, that is the school capacity, 100%, 75%, and 50%. And we're just moving to the results, where we find that when schools operate at full capacity, with low face mask adherence, which is to this bar here, the kind of like whitish bar, there is a large number of deaths compared to when schools operate remotely, which is the blue line here. And it's also kind of close to what happens when there's no face mask. But we find that when we reduce capacity, and even just reducing it to 75%, there is a large decrease in those deaths, and increasing the proportion of people wearing face masks effectively has also a large effect in preventing deaths. Where are these infections and happening? Where are these symptomatic cases happening? So in the top left panel, you can see a lot of infections happen in students. and they are larger than the ones that happen in the teachers and in the households. Well, of course, there are less teachers than students, but you see the opposite trend for symptoms. So in students, there is some symptomatic students, but they're largely they're way lower than the ones that happen in households, for instance, and in proportion to the population here and to the number of infections, they're also larger than the ones that happen in teachers. Something similar we observe when we see the deaths in students and teachers and households. So there is almost no deaths in students, but there's a large proportion, there's a large number of deaths in teachers and households. But when we reopen schools at reduced capacity with a high face mask adherence, we could prevent thousands of deaths in the simulations for instance, in households or in teachers. Finally, just a few conclusions. Well, our estimates are based on the assumption about some individual level behavior and contact patterns. And these results suggest that there's an important contribution to schools in the transmission dynamics. And as I showed, that this happened early in the epidemic and that it might happen if the schools reopen again. Our results also indicate that operating at reduced capacity and having high face mask adherence would reduce the burden of COVID-19 in schools and across the state. Something to keep in mind is that these scenarios are there are simplification of these scenarios that might play out in reality across different districts. And our simulation suggests that even if hundreds of thousands of children were infected this fall semester, few deaths will result from these infections, but these deaths are concentrated among teachers and the school-affiliated families. Finally, one critical assumption of our analysis is that children are just as capable of being infected and transmitted than adults in meaningful levels. So even if they're less susceptible, they're still susceptible enough and that they can transmit it at reasonable levels compared to adults. And well, thank you for allowing me to present here.